Welcome to video number 8. This one's about intensive and extensive production systems. What is intensive production then? Well, with any production of food, wood, there's going to be, or any other product, there's going to be a certain amount of time or money or labour that has to be put into it. So for instance, I might need to buy machinery, there might be fuel costs as we're going along, there might be costs of electricity and so on, or costs of fertilisers. These are all what we call costs, and they're running costs, which are the most important with these systems. With the labour, there might be systems which are more involve the work of humans rather than machines or computers. With systems that you're using machines and computers, there's a lot less labour and effort with them. And then conversely, if there's more labour being put into it, there's more time being put into it. Now, with an intensive farming system, there's high input. We have a very high running cost, and usually the initial costs, sorry, and usually the initial costs are very expensive. We also get a lot of money out. It's what we call high output, and with that, you get a lot of product. You get a lot of animal products, wood, fish, whatever you're producing, and as a result, although you tend to put a lot of money in, you get a lot of money out. So they're very commercial systems used by most producers nowadays to produce things on a large scale. With your extensive systems, it's the total opposite. There's a low input, but there's also a low output. So for example, if I just left sheep wandering on a mountain and collected them in at the end of the year, maybe I'd have to treat them every now and again, once every few months. Certainly with a lot of Welsh hill farming, they're left out for the majority of the year and only come in to be treated maybe once, twice. But that's a very extensive system because there's certainly not a lot of labour being put in. It's just the farmer has to go out and checking them regularly, but only the one person. There's not a lot of money being invested, but there'll be a very low output. You won't get much money for them. Now the extensive systems, because they are less intense and trying to produce less, they tend to have less damaging effects to the environment, but that's not always the case, as we'll see. So there's 4 different types of production systems you have to know about. Animal production, horticulture and crop production, aquaculture, where it's to do with producing water, foods and produce, such as shrimp, crab, salmon, etc. And also then deforestation. With animal production, it's probably one of the biggest most recognised intense systems because of welfare issues that are often involved in it. As a result, it hits the media a lot, and there's a great emphasis on it. And people as well care a lot more about animals than they do about corn. So there's, if anything, most people know more about intense animal production. You take, for instance, battery hen farms. You've probably heard of them, where chickens are kept in long cages for all their life. Once they stop producing eggs at a very intense rate, they're simply killed after a couple of years, they're given feed, don't get to move around much, and eggs come out the back. Now, the idea with a system like this is that they're not expending much energy, so the energy is going towards producing the food rather than the being wasted with energy needed to move around more. They're kept in comfortable conditions to the extent of warmth, so they're not wasting energy burning off and trying to produce heat. But the problem with things like this is mainly for intense systems is boredom. The animals don't get to do much, and as a result, bullying can result. They can develop welfare issues to do with stress because of not having anything to do. And there's lots of systems which are intense with animals. In dairy, some are indoor systems where the cows are constantly kept indoors rather than being allowed to roam in fields. They produce a lot of milk, much more natural than their yields, so much so that some of their udders are actually push the cow's legs apart and can cause lameness. And calves are taken off them at a very young age so that the milk can go to produce the milk can go towards production rather than being taken by the calf. Ironically, these systems probably have the least of all the extensive systems, intensive systems. These probably have the least issues to do with the environment. Maybe there's a large production of slurry and manure which has to be disposed of. And for instance, if that's spread too thoroughly on fields, it can get into waterways and cause problems in water. But it's more to do with the welfare of the animals. That's the issue with intensive farming systems. What you have to remember, though, with any intensive system is that the human population is growing at an exponential rate, massive rate. There will be shortages of food within probably the next 100 years or so, at least that's what some sources say, because there are billions of people in the world. So we need systems of food which are able to supply food for all those people. We've also got intensive horticultural productions where what we call monoculture is used, usually, where you've got huge fields that have knocked down hedgerows. They've grown one crop, so insects and birds can't feed much. They're not adapted for maybe one of the types of food and therefore can't survive there. So the number of different species goes down and we have a low biodiversity. Lots of fertilizers and pesticides are spread which can go into food chains and can get washed into waterways. So intensive horticultural and crop production systems probably got a lot more environmental issues than any animal-based systems. But they're dismissed a lot because not many people worry too much about the welfare of plants. But nowadays we're coming to understand more that these systems can damage the environment and have to have more regulations. For instance, only certain levels of fertilizer and pesticides can be put down. In aquaculture then, intense aquaculture, usually artificial pools are used or tanks where fish are grown in very large numbers. There isn't much of a the boredom of fish isn't considered as much due to the much lower level of intelligence that they have when compared to mammals. Or at least this is what most of the public think, and their opinion is their opinion. But they are kept in enclosed areas where there's a lot in one pool. The only major environmental issue with this is that sometimes with a lot of the larger fish that we eat are carnivorous. So sometimes smaller fish are caught in the wild and deposited in them, and that can cause problems with populations of smaller fish in the wild. But compared to some as we'll see later on in the second video, actually compared to extensive farming systems, aquaculture and intensive farming systems is a lot better sometimes. The last thing then is intensive deforestation. And I'm sure you've seen a lot of conifer forests in this country where they've been planted over a massive area, rows and rows of evergreen conifer trees, because they're a fast-growing tree and can quickly produce timber that's needed. Unfortunately, there's a couple of problems with that. For instance, it isn't the same as the natural ecosystem of the original forests of the UK, the deciduous forests. The animals that were adapted to survive in those can't survive as well in coniferous forests. Pine needles that are dropped make the soil acidic, so plants such as brambles and nettles, which usually grow underneath the trees, and other shrubs can't necessarily grow as well. And the animals which are usually adapted to survive off those plants don't grow as well then. So biodiversity decreases a lot with these systems, these forests that tend to be used for intensive production.